Welcome back, everybody. Today we're making two different types of sandwich bread. The first bread I'm going to show you today is from my original recipe, but I've cut down the measurements to make one single loaf of bread. The second loaf of bread we're making today is made slightly different with an egg and some milk. For a little bit of a softer, a little bit of a longer lasting bread, especially if you prefer soft bread and not toasted, this might be the bread for you. So let's go ahead and get started and make some yummy bread today. The first bread dough I'm going to walk you through today is my original bread from this video here on the screen, except I've reduced the measurements and got it just right to make one single loaf. So to a big bowl, I'm going to add 1 cup of warm water and 2 tablespoons of sugar. You could use honey. Today I'm actually using sugar in the raw, and I really love it, and I'm trying to use less processed sugar. So sugar in the raw, that's what I'm using today. I'm also using this Bella Rise instant yeast. We're going to add 2 teaspoons of this. Now, because this is an instant yeast, you really don't have to let it bloom, but I'm going to let this mixture sit for about 5 minutes until it gets a little bit frothy. Just make sure your yeast is still alive and active. I keep mine in the freezer so it lasts a really long time. Once it starts to look a little bit frothy, we can bring in the other things we're going to add to this dough. I start by adding my flour. So today I'm using the King Author all-purpose flour, and we're going to add 3 cups. Now you want to make sure that you're not really densely packing your cups, right? Too much flour is going to make your bread really heavy and dense. So loosely packed 3 cups. Depending on the temperature in your room, you might want to actually start at 2.5 cups and slowly add up to that 3 cup mark. So 3 cups of flour. Then I'm going to add some sea salt. I like the Celtic sea salt. We're going to add 3/4 of a teaspoon of that. And then we're going to add our fat. So today I'm using tallow that we rendered here at our house. But you could use soft butter, olive oil, avocado oil. You're going to add 2 tablespoons of that, right? So today I'm using tallow. Now, if you have a KitchenAid or some kind of stand mixer, this is going to be so much quicker for you. Today, I wanted to show you that you don't have to have a mixer of any kind to make fabulous bread. All you need is a little dough scraper like this, right, in a big bowl. So I'm going to just hand mix this until everything starts to come together and form like a really shaggy dough. And we're going to fast forward this, y'all, because you need this dough for a good solid 10 minutes. So we're going to fast forward through this, but you'll see the dough starts to come together in the bowl. And then so lightly, I'm going to flour my work table here and knead this dough. I'm not trying to add any more flour, just trying to make sure that the dough doesn't really stick to my table too much. And I'm going to knead this for a good solid 10 minutes. You might need to go more. But yeah, a stand mixer really frees you up while it's mixing and kneading your dough, right? But I feel like this is kind of therapy in my day. And I've actually really come to enjoy the time that I'm making the bread. And I've actually switched over from not using my stand mixer at all when I make bread. And I actually enjoy it a whole lot more. So we're just going to knead this dough and pull it into a tight little nice ball. And then we're going to stick it into a bowl, and you can just really lightly oil your bowl. I'm just using olive oil. And put the dough in there, and we're going to cover this and put it in a non-drafty place until the dough rises by double, right? You want it to be twice as big as it was when you put it in the bowl. Now our second dough we're going to get started on, right? So this one we're using milk, and I just put some milk in a little saucepan and warmed it up to about 110 degrees. 1 cup of milk. This is a whole milk. If you're doing milk substitutes, I haven't tried those. And it might work just as fine, but this is whole milk. And to this, I'm also adding the 2 tablespoons of sugar in the raw and the 2 teaspoons of the instant yeast, just like we did before. And again, with this dough, I'm going to give it a stir and I'm going to just let it sit for a few minutes as I gather my stuff and just let it get a little frothy, right? So just give that a stir and let it sit. You can grab your other stuff while you're waiting. So for this bread dough, I'm going to add 1 of our eggs. Okay, I like to usually, these are fresh eggs, y'all, and I just washed it. So I like to just crack it in a separate bowl. And I like to just stir it up and just whisk this egg really good before I add it to everything in my bowl. Just makes mixing up the bread dough a little bit easier. So we're going to whisk that egg. Isn't that yolk gorgeous? We free range our chickens. At least once a day they get some free range time. And our eggs are just gorgeous. We're going to add that right into our bowl. We're going to start with our flour. Again, we're using 3 cups of flour. Now this bread dough is going to be a little bit more wet and a little bit more sticky because of the addition of the egg, okay? Same amount of fluid. We're just using milk this time. But the addition of the egg makes this dough a little bit stickier, so just know that. There's my 3/4 of a teaspoon of sea salt. Next, I'm going to add my 2 tablespoons of tallow. Again, soft butter would be great, or an avocado oil is very neutral tasting, right? And good for you. Olive oil is great too if you would rather use that. We're going to add 2 tablespoons and then start to mix this up. Now you'll see that this is going to be a wetter dough. It's going to take maybe a little bit longer for it to come together just because it's kind of sticky, right? Scraping the sides of the bowl. Just make sure you get all that flour incorporated in there. And because it's sticky, you're going to be tempted to add more flour to this to get it to come together. But the more flour, the denser and heavier your bread's going to be. So I try to avoid the temptation of dumping more flour in there. It's going to be a little bit more wet, a little bit more shaggy and sticky. But usually when it gets to be about like this is when I'm going to dump this out and start to knead it, right? Just making sure I get everything from that bowl. I kind of wanted to do this part in real time so that you see. But we're going to fast forward it here in a minute, and you're going to want to knead this too for a good 10 minutes. Which is quite a little workout on your arms, which I could use. And again, it's just time for me. I usually have music on and enjoy the process. And for me, it's been actually something that I actually look forward to in my week. Making the bread, kneading the bread, and all that stuff. So this one's going to be quite a bit stickier. You see, it wants to stick to my table. And I resist adding too much flour. I try to knead it for a little bit, just using my little bread scraper, my dough scraper, to clean up the table as I'm working along. Incorporate that back into the dough. And then I'll come in with a little bit of flour and the dough starts coming together. Again, I really don't want to add a lot of flour to the dough. Just enough to get it to pull together and get it kneaded. Now this bread dough, or this bread, when it's cooked, it is probably my favorite white bread that I've made so far. I love, like my original bread that I've shared with you, I love that bread. But this one stays so much softer, so much longer. And I like toast, but I like sandwiches that the bread's not toasted. So this has turned into be my favorite white bread. Now I want to show you, we're going to go ahead and pull back the first dough, right? So this is our water and yeast bread dough. No egg, no milk with this bread dough. The bread dough has doubled. Depending on the temperature in your room, this could take 30 minutes. It could take an hour, right? Just keep an eye on it. And once the bread dough has doubled in size, you're ready to go ahead and start to shape it. So I've put it here on my table. And I'm going to just stretch it out. You'll see the dough is not sticky at all at this point. It's very soft, really easy to work with. And I like to make a big rectangle and then fold it over about halfway and then fold it over again. And I just like to pokey my dough. I'm just really gentle with it. And then we're going to start rolling and forming our loaf. And I like to add a little bit of tension, just rolling it up nice and tight. See how pretty that is? Once it's nice and rolled up, I'm going to just flip it over so the seam is facing up. And I like to tuck in my ends. Just pushing those ends right inside and rolling the bread dough over to the back. Go right along the bottom and seal up the end of that bread dough, forming a nice tight little loaf that's going to fit right into our loaf pan. So depending on your loaf pan, you might want to give it a quick spray with some cooking oil. You might want to use a little bit of parchment paper. I have found that with my Pioneer Woman loaf pans, I don't have to use anything. So I have not sprayed my pans at all, and the bread just releases from these. I absolutely love these bread pans. We're going to let this sit and rise one more time, right? It might go for 30 minutes, 45 minutes, depending again on the temperature and humidity in your room. Now this is our white bread using water. I'm going to give it a diagonal slice before it rises and just score it like this so we know which bread is which, right? It's going to be hard to keep track when we have two loaves on our table. Now this is our bread dough with the egg and milk. You'll see it's slightly a little bit more yellow, right? It's slightly darker than the other bread dough. Not by much. I've let that double in size, and we're gonna go through and do the same thing. I've just poked it down, poked all the air out with my fingers. You could punch it if you want to. I tend to be a little bit lighter handed. And I'm gonna stretch it out to a great big rectangle. Just shape it a little bit. And then again, I go ahead and fold it twice. Just like the other bread dough. And then I flip that dough around and form a longer rectangle like this. And then I start rolling it nice and tight. Isn't that just so pretty? Again, we're going to just push in the ends on this loaf. And right along that bottom seam, we're just going to pinch it nice and tight and close that seam up. perfect. I have fallen in love with making bread. There is our perfect little bread loaf, and we're gonna put that right in our pan and let that rise again. I just like to cover my doughs with like a tea towel. You could use saran wrap or like a wet towel if you wanted to. Now I wanted to bring over the loaf because I want to show you when it's ready to bake, right? I like to check on it. I notice that it's rising and I push on it with my finger, and if that indentation with my finger rises back really quickly, I know that it still has a little bit more rising to do, right? So that was the first time I checked it, and now we're going to come back on the second time and you see it's risen even more. And when I poke it with my finger, the indentation stays sunken in longer. See the difference? So this is going to go in my oven. Now these loaves of bread are going to bake at 350 for about 30 minutes, okay? So the first bread dough is in the oven, and this is our dough that has the egg and milk. And I'm just going to give it a score right down the middle. Just like that. And now we know this one is our sandwich loaf that has the egg and milk. And that's going to go in the oven for about 30 minutes. So this one came out first because I mixed it up first and it went in the oven first. This is our original bread dough using the water. Look how pretty that crust is. You'll see it rose even more in the oven. I think the magic trick to the rising is not over rising during the proofing time, right? I used to have a tendency of letting my bread overproof in the rising time, and then in the oven it did not rise very much, right? So I've kept a closer eye on it and have learned not to overproof my bread, and then I get a gorgeous rise in the oven. Isn't that so pretty? That is gorgeous. It has a nice little crust to it, but the bread is so soft in the middle. So here comes my second loaf. Now sometimes the scores do a little thing, but doesn't that still look delicious? Do you notice the difference on the crust on this one versus the first one that I pulled out though? The crust tends to be much smoother than the original bread recipe, right? So I've just pulled out the bread that has the egg and the milk. And once these come out of the oven, you're going to want to go ahead and just pop them out of the pans and put them on a cooling rack. And I like to wait until they're cooled down to slice them. But you don't have to. Nice warm butter, nice warm bread with some butter. Doesn't that sound delicious? Now these are the two loaves sitting side by side, and they're both pretty hot right at this point. But these are the two bread loaves just sitting side by side. They both are phenomenal breads. They both make perfect sandwiches. In my opinion, the bread with the egg and the milk stays softer a few days longer. But toasted, both breads for us last about 5 to 7 days, if it lasts that long in our house. So I usually make one loaf a week, and we have sandwiches or a slice of bread here and there for breakfast. So let's go ahead and slice this bread so that you can see what the crumb on the inside looks like, right? So I'm slicing the first loaf, which was made using the water. And this is so fresh. It has just cooled off. It's been maybe 2 hours, right? It's just cooled off. But this bread is so soft, it's a little bit harder to slice. So I'm still having to be gentle with it. Now the next day, it won't be as soft, right? So it's not going to cave in when you start to slice it as much. But when you first bake it, it is pretty soft. So that's the inside of the bread. And I don't know if you can tell or not how soft that is, but it is super soft. And look how tall it is. This bread makes perfect sandwiches. And there's the inside of my slices. So let's see how this next bread compares. I'm going to bring that over. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to take about 4 or 5 slices of it. Just so you can see what the slices look like, what the bread looks like on the inside. I really like both breads. There's sometimes when I go to make bread that we don't have milk in the house. Y'all, Harlan will drink a gallon of milk in 2 days. And when I think I have milk and I go check, sometimes I don't. So it's really nice that I can still make bread without having to have the milk, right? But if I have the milk, my preference is this. And see how soft that is? So if we have the milk, I'm making this bread. If we don't, I have absolutely no problems making the other. And it was really hard to show you without squeezing the bread so much how soft it is. I like the crust on this bread. It's my favorite. So there you go. I'm going to just clean up my mess here and just slide this bread over so you can get one good last look at it. But I have just fallen in love with the whole process. I love that this is one less thing we buy at the store, right? In the last 4 or 5 months, the only thing bread-wise I've bought from the store is hot dog buns, which is on my list of things to learn. But there you go, 2 different breads, simple recipes and easy to make at home. And let's knock off bread from our grocery list. If you give this a try, I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you really soon.